By the time I stepped into the study, I already knew the ledger wouldn't balance. The afternoon light fell in narrow bars through the blinds, striping the desk in pale gold and shadow. But the figures on the page were the true darkness. $42,000 unaccounted for. Missing. Vanished as if the numbers themselves had been scrubbed from reality. I had kept that ledger by hand for over 5 decades. Even when the world shifted to machines, I trusted the feel of paper beneath my palm, the scratch of a pen that didn't lie. My father kept books the same way, and his father before him. Every dollar earned was a line of our history. Every expense, a fragment of our trust. That's why I knew what I was looking at wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. It was in that stillness, listening to the muffled hum of air outside, that my mind settled on one name. My son, Daniel. He had been distant lately, answering questions with half smiles and vague promises, avoiding the office for meetings that never appeared on any schedule. I told myself he was just tired, that maybe the years of working under my shadow had worn him down. But those missing numbers spoke louder than excuses. The first time I noticed something was wrong was weeks earlier, when the office smelled faintly of whiskey in the morning. Daniel never drank before lunch. He was sharp about appearances, careful about keeping the line between business and indulgence. But that day, his handshake had been loose, his eyes bloodshot. He brushed it off with a joke about a late night with friends. I had let it go. Now I wished I'd pressed harder. It wasn't just the money, it was the breach. This was our family business. 3 generations of Smithmen had built it from the ground up, starting with a pawn shop off Fremont Street and growing into one of the most respected antiques dealers in Nevada. I thought I had taught him that the business wasn't just about profit, it was about honor. That afternoon, I didn't call him. I didn't storm into his house. Instead, I locked the ledger away, poured myself a small glass of rye, and sat in my leather chair, letting the city's noise seep in through the glass. Out there, in the chaos of Las Vegas, theft was a language everyone understood. But inside these walls, it was treason. 2 days later, I saw him at the office. He was wearing a new watch, a gaudy gold thing, nothing like his usual understated taste. He caught me looking at it and grinned. "Gift from a client," he said. His tone was too light, his smile too quick. That was when I realized the watch had been bought with our money. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation without preparation is surrender. Instead, I began changing the locks on our accounts, shifting funds into places only I could reach, reworking deals so that his signature meant nothing. Each move was quiet, deliberate, the way a man clears a chessboard before setting his own pieces. At night, I lay awake, thinking of the first time Daniel had set foot in the shop. He was 7, barely tall enough to see over the counter, but he'd asked me what every item was worth. I told him worth wasn't just about price. It was about story, rarity, the hands it had passed through. I never thought I'd have to remind him of that. The final push came when one of our longtime suppliers called to ask if we were still good for payment on a shipment Daniel had personally handled. My chest tightened. If our name was being dragged through the mud because of him, the damage would reach further than any missing sum. And that was the moment I knew the punishment would have to be mine to deliver. I repeated those words to myself like a vow as I watched Daniel from across the shop the next morning. He was laughing with a customer, his voice warm, his posture easy, as though the walls around him weren't closing in. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already begun to shift. I noticed small tells, the way he checked his phone when he thought no one was looking, the glances toward the back office where the safe was kept, the faint sheen of sweat along his hairline, despite the air conditioning. Every gesture was a confession without words. The more I studied him, the more I understood that whatever he was tangled in went deeper than simple greed. It was just after lunch when I called him into my office. The light outside had turned harsh. pressing against the blinds like heat itself wanted to get in. He stepped inside, hands in his pockets, smile ready. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe like we were equals. That casual stance was his first mistake. Halfway through our talk, I slid an old photograph across the desk, a picture of my father standing in front of the pawnshop in 1956. Daniel glanced at it, then back at me, confusion flickering in his eyes. "You ever think about how we got here?" I asked. He shrugged, muttered something about hard work, but there was no conviction in it. That was when I realized he had stopped seeing this business as a legacy and started seeing it as a vault he could plunder. The minor shift in my approach came then. Instead of pressing him about the missing funds, I asked about his investments. For a second, his expression cracked. "Nothing serious," he said too quickly, and I knew that the missing money had already been sunk into something reckless. That night, I drove through the city without a destination. Neon signs bled into the pavement, each one promising something for a price. I thought about my father again, about how he used to warn me that in Las Vegas, temptation wasn't an event. It was the air you breathed. I had believed I was strong enough to raise a son immune to it. A week later, I caught the first undeniable proof. A friend in the casino business mentioned seeing Daniel at a high-stakes table, chips stacked high in front of him, then gone within an hour. He'd left pale, jaw tight, walking like a man whose pockets had just been turned inside out. That image burned into my mind. I didn't confront him. Not yet. A public confrontation could ruin us both, and I needed him bound by debt before I pulled the rug from under him. The trick to real punishment is timing. It must arrive when the offender believes he's safe. So I kept up appearances, even praised him in front of the staff, letting him think his father was still blind. But inside, I was already dismantling his safety nets. I spoke to our lawyers, updated account authorizations, shifted ownership titles to my name alone. The weight of secrecy pressed on me at night, but it was a burden I welcomed. Every quiet move I made was a brick in the wall closing around him. The hardest part was remembering the boy he had been, the one who once polished the shop's counters after school, who asked me if the gold coins in the display were magic. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose ambition had soured into entitlement. I knew the day would come soon when the accounts would run dry for him, when every path back to solvency would lead through me. And when it did, he would learn the cost of treating blood like collateral. That thought clung to me in the days that followed, curling around every decision I made. I moved through the shop with a steady, deliberate pace, never letting my gaze linger on him long enough to betray my thoughts. He still believed he had the upper hand, still walked with that lazy confidence of a man who thought the family name would always shield him. But the more I watched him, the more I noticed cracks widening beneath the surface. The calls he took in the back alley, voice lowered but never quite low enough to hide the sharp tone. The late arrivals, the hurried departures, the faint scent of expensive cologne I'd never smelled on him before. He was playing a game, but he didn't know the rules had already changed. Halfway through that week, I decided to test him. I left a stack of unfiled invoices on the desk, each tied to legitimate transactions, but with subtle discrepancies, numbers that could be corrected by someone desperate enough to move funds. The next morning, I found the papers back in the drawer, but the corrections were sloppy, rushed. That was when I realized he was no longer trying to hide his tracks. He was trying to keep up with obligations he couldn't meet. The minor shift in understanding came that evening, when I returned to the shop after closing. The street outside was nearly silent, the neon signs humming against the darkness. Inside, I found him at my desk, staring at the open ledger. He didn't hear me at first, and I stood there, unseen, watching his shoulders sag. For a moment, I almost saw regret in the curve of his spine, but then he straightened, closed the book, and left without noticing me. Regret, I realized, wasn't enough to stop him. That night, I poured myself another rye and thought about the first time my father let me handle a deal on my own. I had been 19, nervous, certain I'd make a mistake, but I'd learned that trust was a gift that could only be broken once. Daniel was about to find out what it felt like to have that gift taken away. 2 days later, I received another quiet confirmation of my suspicions. A contact in the jewelry district mentioned that Daniel had been pawning items from his personal collection, items I'd given him over the years. He wasn't just spending recklessly, he was dismantling the pieces of history I'd entrusted to him. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I arranged a meeting with an old associate at a downtown bank. The plan was simple: consolidate the accounts, move the funds, and lock the gates behind me. Every dollar would be out of his reach before he even realized it was gone. When I returned to the shop that evening, he was there, leaning against the counter, phone in hand. He looked up and smiled, but it was a brittle thing, stretched too thin. "Slow day?" he asked. I nodded, giving nothing away. If he sensed the storm coming, he gave no sign. But I knew the moment was approaching. The trap was nearly set. One more shift, one more withdrawal, and the only thing he'd have left was the debt he'd wrapped himself in. That was when I'd make him come to me, when the pride that had once kept him from asking for help would crumble under the weight of desperation. And when that day came, I would be ready to make him answer for every stolen dollar, every lie, every moment he'd mistaken my silence for weakness. I told myself this again the following morning as I walked into the shop, the faint smell of polish and dust rising from the wooden counters. Daniel was already there, leaning over the register, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the figures, as though willing them to change. He didn't greet me. That was new. I moved past him without a word, into my office, shutting the door behind me. My hand lingered on the ledger before opening it. Every entry now felt like an indictment, every missing sum a knot in the rope tightening around him. The accounts were nearly cleared into my own control. Just one final transfer remained. After that, he would have nothing to draw from. Around midday, he came into the office uninvited, pacing instead of sitting. "We've got a supplier breathing down our neck," he said. "Payment's overdue." I let the silence hang, just long enough for him to fill it. "I'll handle it," he added quickly, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. He was juggling more than I'd realized. The mid-shift came when he mentioned, almost carelessly, that he might have to bring in outside money to smooth things over. The phrase hit me harder than it should have. Outside money meant outsiders in our business, strangers poking into ledgers that had been private for 3 generations. That was when I realized this wasn't just about theft anymore. He was desperate enough to sell pieces of our foundation to whoever would give him a lifeline. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same black and white photo of my father in front of the pawn shop, his hand on my shoulder the day he made me partner. He'd told me, "Once you let someone else own a part of you, they'll want the rest." I could hear his voice now, as if he were standing in the doorway. Daniel was inviting wolves into the house, and if I didn't act fast, they'd chew through the walls. The next morning, I made the last transfer. Watching the balance vanish from the joint account was like closing a door on a room I'd never step into again. That money was mine now, untouchable, locked away in a place he couldn't find. I left just enough in the business account to cover legitimate expenses, but nothing that could be siphoned into whatever hole he'd been feeding. Later that day, I caught him on the phone in the alley, speaking in a low, urgent tone. He saw me and ended the call mid-sentence. "Just a friend," he said, but his eyes didn't match his voice. The smell of cigarette smoke clung to him, though he hadn't smoked in years. He was unraveling, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his movements. That fear told me everything. It told me that the debts weren't just numbers. There were people behind them, people who didn't wait politely for repayment. And it told me that whatever mask he'd been wearing was starting to crack. By closing time, he was gone without a word. I locked up alone, listening to the hum of the neon signs outside. For years, those lights had meant safety to me, a reminder that the shop was still standing, that our name still carried weight. But that night, they felt like warning beacons. I knew then that the first confrontation was coming sooner than I'd planned. And when it came, I wouldn't be asking questions. I'd be giving terms. That thought steadied me as I stepped into the shop the next morning, the chime above the door breaking the stale quiet. Daniel was behind the counter, pretending to sort a tray of watches, but I could tell from the stiffness in his shoulders that he'd been waiting for me. I didn't speak at first. I walked the length of the shop, running my hand over the glass display cases, each one lined with pieces older than both of us combined. He followed me with his eyes, but not his voice. Only when I turned toward the office did he break the silence. "We need to talk," he said. The words were less a request than an announcement. I let him follow me inside, closed the door, and sat down at the desk. He stayed standing, arms crossed, jaw set. "I know you've been moving the money," he said flatly. There it was, the shift I'd been waiting for. No denial, no attempt to charm his way out. Just a blunt recognition of the wall I'd built between him and the funds. Halfway through his speech about needing liquidity and temporary setbacks, I saw something flicker in his expression. It wasn't just fear, it was calculation. He was still looking for an angle, still convinced he could bargain his way out. That was when I realized he didn't understand the depth of his position. He thought this was a negotiation. It wasn't. I leaned back, studying him the way a jeweler studies a flawed diamond. "You've been using our name to cover your debts," I said, "and now you've run out of name." The words landed like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He just tightened his grip on his arms, as if holding himself together. The minor twist came when he laughed. A short, bitter sound. "You think you're the only one protecting something?" he said. "You don't know who I've been dealing with?" His voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with business. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about casinos or bad investments. He'd crossed into territory where the currency was fear. I didn't show it, but his words settled deep. My father used to warn me about men who dealt in favors instead of contracts. "They own you without paper," he'd say. If Daniel had stumbled into that world, the cost of pulling him out would be more than money. Still, I didn't relent. "Here are the terms," I told him. "You're going to pay every cent back, not to me, but to the business. You'll work under my oversight, every transaction checked, every deal approved. No exceptions." I expected an argument, maybe even an outburst. Instead, he nodded once, the kind of nod a man gives when he's already thinking about something else. That was the moment I knew this agreement wasn't the end. It was the opening move in something larger. His acceptance came too easily, too quickly. And as he left the office, the faintest smirk crossed his face, as if he'd heard music I couldn't yet detect. That night, the city outside seemed sharper, the neon cutting through the dark like knives. I lay awake, thinking about the way his eyes had lingered on the safe before he left. There was something in that look, a promise, or maybe a threat. And as I stared at the ceiling, I realized I hadn't trapped him at all. I'd just stepped onto his board. The thought pressed against me, like a weight in my chest the next morning, even as I unlocked the shop and went about the motions of another day. The air felt different, sharper, heavier, as though the walls themselves understood the balance of power had shifted. Daniel arrived late, strolling in with the casual arrogance of a man who believes lateness is a privilege. He didn't mention our conversation from the day before, and neither did I. Instead, I watched him from behind the counter as he moved through the shop, greeting customers, smiling easily, masking the tension I knew was coiled beneath the surface. By midday, he disappeared into the back office for a call. I didn't follow, but I stayed close enough to hear the faint rhythm of his voice. Low, urgent, measured in a way that told me the conversation mattered. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught the shift in tone when he said, "Soon, I promise." That single promise was enough to tighten every nerve in me. The midpoint shift came when I noticed he had started keeping a small leather notebook in his inside jacket pocket. Daniel was never one for handwritten records. He preferred the anonymity of numbers on a screen. If he was writing something down now, it meant he didn't want it traced through the usual channels. That book was a secret, and whatever it contained wasn't meant for my eyes. That night, over a quiet dinner at home, I thought about my father again. He used to say that the most dangerous man in a negotiation wasn't the loud one, it was the one taking notes. "He's not recording facts," he'd say. "He's building leverage." Daniel had learned that lesson. Maybe from me, maybe from someone else entirely. 2 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the shop. A tall man in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He didn't browse. He walked straight to Daniel, shook his hand, and they spoke in hushed tones near the door. The man left without buying a thing, but not before glancing at me with an expression I couldn't place, half amusement, half warning. That was my minor twist. I realized Daniel's debts had faces. Real people. People who could walk through my door without hesitation, who could look me in the eye and remind me, without a word, that my son was entangled in something far more dangerous than a missing sum. I doubled my precautions after that, locked the safe twice a day, changed the alarm codes, checked the ledgers against every invoice personally. And still, there was that leather notebook in his jacket, the unseen hand-moving pieces on a game board I hadn't agreed to play on. One evening, I stayed late, pretending to be busy in the office while Daniel closed the front of the shop. Through the crack in the door, I saw him pull the notebook from his pocket and write quickly, glancing at the safe between lines. He tore out a page, folded it, and slipped it into his wallet. I didn't move, but my mind was already turning over the possibilities. Names, amounts, dates. Whatever it wasn't for me to see. Not yet. As I left that night, locking the front door behind us, Daniel gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll get through this," he said, almost gently. But his tone wasn't comforting. It was transactional, like a dealer promising a payout that would never come. And in that moment, I understood he wasn't trying to survive my punishment. He was planning his counterattack. The knowledge didn't hit like a sudden blow. It seeped in, slow and steady, a cold tide rising around my ankles. Every word he'd spoken, every glance, every calculated silence over the past weeks took on a different weight. He wasn't on the defensive. He'd been setting his own pieces in place all along. The next morning, I arrived at the shop earlier than usual, hoping to catch him off guard. The streets were still quiet, the neon signs fading in the weak desert dawn. Inside, I moved through the rooms, checking locks, counting inventory, tracing my hand over the safe's cold metal. Everything appeared untouched, but the air carried a faint tension, like a room someone had just left. Daniel walked in 15 minutes later, coffee in one hand, that damned leather notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't seem surprised to see me so early. If anything, his expression was almost amused. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sipping from his cup without waiting for an answer. By midday, we were both at the counter when a package arrived. Plain brown paper, no return address. I signed for it and set it aside, but I caught Daniel's eyes flick toward it more than once. When I finally opened it, the contents stopped me cold. A single pawn ticket from a seedy shop on the edge of town, with the description of an item I recognized instantly, an antique gold chronometer that had been in our safe 3 weeks ago. The midpoint shift came hard. This wasn't an oversight or a theft by some outsider. This was Daniel moving pieces without my knowledge, liquidating family property and funneling it into whatever scheme he was building. The pawn ticket wasn't just a receipt, it was proof of intent. That night, I drove out to the address listed on the slip. The shop was small, the kind of place where desperate men exchanged heirlooms for bills that vanished in a day. The owner didn't ask questions. He recognized me, glanced at the ticket, and returned the chronometer without protest. But as he handed it over, he muttered, "You might want to tell your boy he's running out of friends." The phrase stayed with me on the drive back. Running out of friends. It meant there had been allies once, people willing to help him, or at least take his money, and now they were stepping away. That could only mean the stakes were higher than I'd guessed. Back at the shop, I locked the chronometer in a separate drawer, away from the safe. I wanted to confront him then, but something stopped me. My father used to warn me, "If you want the whole truth, let the liar think he's still winning." Daniel still believed he could outmaneuver me. I needed him to keep believing that. Over the next 2 days, I noticed changes. He made more calls in the back room, always in short, clipped sentences. He started carrying cash instead of using cards. And twice, I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, as though measuring my reactions for some private equation. The minor twist came late one evening, as we were closing. He handed me the day's receipts, but slipped in a folded scrap of paper. "You might need this," he said, without explanation. When I opened it later, it was a name and a number. No context, no hint of why it mattered, but I knew enough to understand it wasn't a gift. It was bait. And as I sat in the quiet, staring at that paper, I realized he'd just made his first open move against me. I turned the note over in my hands again and again, tracing the scrawled name and number with my thumb. The ink was fresh, the handwriting deliberate. Daniel didn't do anything without reason. If he'd given this to me, it meant one of two things. Either he wanted me to see something, or he wanted me to step into a trap. The next morning, I didn't mention the note. I tucked it into my wallet and went about business as usual, keeping my voice level and my eyes watchful. Daniel seemed lighter, almost cheerful, as if he'd gotten the better of me in some invisible exchange. He whistled under his breath while polishing the glass cases, the sound slicing through the shop's stillness like a blade. Around midday, I stepped outside to check a delivery and made the call. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered, suspicious but not unfriendly. I gave no name, only asked to meet. The man on the other end hesitated, then told me a time and place. Tonight, an old diner off Sahara Avenue, the kind that never closed and never asked questions. The midpoint shift came as soon as I walked through the diner's door that night. The man in the booth was older, his suit worn but tailored, his eyes sharp despite the lines on his face. He introduced himself as Mason, and without prompting, he said, "You're here about Daniel." My guard went up instantly. This was no casual contact. This was someone who had been waiting for me. Mason spoke plainly. Daniel had borrowed money 6 months ago, more than I'd imagined, from people who didn't write contracts. "He's been making payments," Mason said, "but not enough, not fast enough." Then he leaned forward, voice dropping, "And he's been telling them, 'You'll make it right.'" Those words settled like ice in my stomach. Daniel wasn't just gambling with his own name, he was gambling with mine, with the family's. My father's warning echoed in my mind. Once you let another man spend your reputation, you can't buy it back. I didn't agree to anything. I thanked Mason, paid for my untouched coffee, and left without looking back. On the drive home, the city's lights felt harsher, less like the familiar glow of my territory, and more like searchlights. Every face I passed could have belonged to someone watching me for him. The minor twist came the following day. Daniel didn't ask if I'd made the call. Instead, he looked at me with that faint smirk again and said, "I guess you know now." He wasn't apologizing. He was gauging my reaction, waiting to see whether I'd move toward anger or fear. I gave him neither. Over the next week, I began changing my movements, arriving at the shop earlier, leaving later, keeping records in duplicate and hiding the originals. If Daniel was weaving a web around me, I intended to cut through every thread before it tightened. But I couldn't shake the image of Mason's eyes, the way they measured me like a man deciding whether I was worth investing in or worth removing. One evening, as I was locking the safe, I heard Daniel's voice in the front room. He was speaking to someone just outside the door, low but urgent. When I stepped out, the street was empty, but a black sedan was idling half a block away. Its headlights caught my eyes before it rolled slowly into the dark. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just my son's game anymore. There were other players now, and they were already inside the house. That realization turned the air in the shop heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the threat. I started noticing things I might have ignored before. The faint smell of cologne I didn't recognize lingering after closing. The sound of the front door creaking in the night, even though the locks were intact. Daniel carried himself differently too. Less hurried, less anxious. He moved like a man who had an army behind him, as though the weight of his debts no longer belonged to him alone. That was more dangerous than the desperation I'd seen before. Desperate men make mistakes. Protected men grow bold. One afternoon, while I was in the back inventory room, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone. His voice was calm, deliberate. "The old man will fold soon enough," he said. I froze where I stood, my hands resting on a crate of silverware. He wasn't trying to win me over anymore. He was planning for my defeat. The midpoint shift came later that day, when a delivery truck pulled up unannounced. Daniel signed for the crates before I even reached the door. I asked what they were, and he said, "Just stock I ordered." But when I pried open the corner of one box, I found not antiques, but brand new electronics. Flat-screen televisions still in their packaging. The kind of merchandise our business had never touched. I didn't have to ask who the real buyer was. These crates weren't meant for our shelves. They were currency for whatever network Daniel had tied himself to. And worse, they were sitting in my storeroom, under my name. That night, I sat in my office long after he'd gone, staring at the open ledger. Every page felt like a confession, not just his, but mine, for letting it get this far. My father's voice came back to me. "If you see rot in the wood, you cut it out before it spreads." I'd been chipping away at Daniel's reach quietly, but it was time to strike openly. The minor twist came when I reached for the phone to call a trusted contact in law enforcement, only to find a note under the receiver. 4 words, in Daniel's handwriting: "Don't make it worse." It wasn't a plea, it was a warning. He knew exactly what my next move would be, and he'd beaten me to it. The next morning, I pretended nothing had changed. I helped a couple pick out a silver tea set. I answered calls. I even shared lunch with Daniel in the back office. But every smile I gave him was calculated, every laugh measured. If there were other players in my house, I needed to learn their rules before I moved again. That evening, as I locked the shop, I saw the black sedan again, parked farther down the street this time, its engine running. A figure sat in the driver's seat, not looking at me, but not looking away either. I didn't break stride, but I felt the weight of their eyes until I turned the corner. And in that moment, I realized the game had changed again. I wasn't just protecting the business now, I was protecting my life. That thought stayed with me like a shadow the next morning, following me from the moment I turned the shop key to the instant the blinds rattled against the window pane in the hot Nevada wind. Every sound felt sharper, every movement in the street worth watching. Daniel came in late, wearing the same shirt as the day before, a faint smudge along the collar. He looked tired but not beaten. If anything, he seemed more assured, more certain of the invisible net around him. He didn't mention the black sedan. Neither did I. Some things were better left unsaid until the right moment. By mid-morning, a man I didn't recognize walked in. Stocky build, short hair, dark eyes that moved over the shop like they were cataloguing more than the merchandise. He didn't browse. He walked up to Daniel, said something too low for me to hear, and handed him a small envelope. Daniel slid it into his pocket without looking inside. The midpoint shift came when I caught Daniel in the back office 30 minutes later, counting stacks of cash from that envelope. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "Advance on a deal," he said. His voice was casual, but his hands tightened slightly around the bills. I didn't press, at least not yet. I'd learned that pressing too early only sent him deeper into the shadows. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Daniel wasn't just indebted, he was functioning as a courier, maybe even a fence, for people who didn't belong anywhere near our family business. And with every transaction that touched my shop, I was being pulled into the undertow. That night, I drove out past the strip, into a stretch of desert where the city's lights faded into nothing. My father had taken me here once when I was young, to remind me of two things: that the desert could swallow a man whole, and that silence could be the most valuable currency. I sat in the car, thinking about how far Daniel had taken us from that lesson. The minor twist came the next morning, when I found the safe open. Nothing was missing, not a single piece, but the lock had been reset to a new combination. Daniel was the only other person with access. He didn't mention it, didn't even glance toward the safe all day, as if daring me to ask. That silence told me more than any confession could. He was letting me know he could touch everything I still controlled. From that moment, my focus shifted. This wasn't just about tightening the walls around him. It was about reclaiming the ground under my feet before it disappeared entirely. I started moving high-value items into off-site storage, shifting account access to names Daniel didn't know, sealing every crack I could find. One evening, as we were closing, he lingered by the door. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said, his tone almost bored. But there was something else in his eyes, something cold, like a man already rehearsing the eulogy for what he meant to destroy. I watched him walk into the night, the glow of the street lamps breaking across his shoulders, and I knew then that the next move would have to be mine, and it would have to be decisive. Because if I waited any longer, I wouldn't just lose the business. I'd lose the only advantage I had left: control over how this ended. That thought was a steady drumbeat in my head as I unlocked the shop the next morning. The air inside was cool and still, but I felt as though I'd stepped into enemy territory. Every shelf, every display case, every locked drawer could be a piece Daniel was using against me. He arrived right on time, which in itself was unusual. His shirt was pressed, his hair neat, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet me, just walked to the back room and began rummaging through files like he owned the place. I didn't stop him. Sometimes letting a man think he's free is the fastest way to see where he's headed. By late morning, he'd been on 2 phone calls, both short and clipped, both ending with that faint smirk he seemed to wear like armor. I stayed in the front, watching the street. The black sedan hadn't appeared in days, but I didn't believe for a second it was gone. People like that didn't vanish. They just moved where you couldn't see them. The midpoint shift came when a delivery boy brought in a small battered box addressed to me. No return address, no sender's name. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, was one of my father's old fountain pens. I'd kept it locked in the safe for decades. The lock hadn't been forced, the safe hadn't been damaged, but the pen was here, and Daniel was watching me open it. He said nothing, just smiled, and that smile told me the pen wasn't a gift. It was a message. He could take from me whenever he wanted, without warning, without trace. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the pen lying between my hands. I thought about the day my father gave it to me, about the ink stains on his fingers, the way he said a man's word was only as good as the tools he used to sign it. And now here it was, stolen and returned, like a signature on a contract I hadn't agreed to. The minor twist came the next day, when one of our regular customers, a man who'd known my father, mentioned seeing Daniel at a poker table in the Bellagio. "He looked flush," the man said. Guess business is good. I forced a smile, but inside I knew the truth. He wasn't gambling with winnings. He was gambling with my survival. I decided to accelerate my plan. That evening, after Daniel left, I went into the back office and began pulling files, sales records, client lists, anything that could be turned into cash or favors. I stored them in a locked case and carried it out to my car. Every piece I moved was one less weapon in his arsenal. But I also knew this was no longer a quiet war. He'd made it personal. The pen, the safe, the smirk, they weren't just provocations, they were declarations. As I locked up that night, I caught him watching me from across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there, lit by the sickly yellow glow, until I turned the corner and lost sight of him. And in that moment, I understood the next stage had begun. One where the fight would be out in the open, and only one of us would walk away with the family name intact. I woke the next morning with that sentence, still looping in my head, not as a thought, but as a verdict. The air in the shop felt different when I unlocked the door, like the start of a storm you can't see yet but can smell in the distance. Daniel arrived earlier than I expected, carrying a manila folder under his arm. He didn't greet me. He just placed the folder on the counter between us and said, "You're going to want to see this." Inside were photocopies, bank statements, invoices, and at the bottom, a single page with my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. My first thought was that he'd forged it. My second was worse. He'd had someone else do it. The penmanship was flawless, almost too perfect. If I hadn't known every loop and line of my own hand, I might have believed it was mine. The document authorized a transfer from one of the accounts I'd moved out of his reach. The date was last week. The midpoint shift came with his next words. "If you don't step aside, this goes to the police. They'll believe you skimmed from your own business to hide something." His tone was calm, almost conversational, as if we were discussing weather. I stared at him, searching for some flicker of shame, but all I saw was the same cold calculation I'd noticed for weeks. That night, I took the folder home and laid it on my desk, unopened. I didn't need to read it again. The meaning was clear. He'd moved from manipulation to outright blackmail. My father used to say, "When a man corners you with a blade, you either disarm him or take the cut." I wasn't ready to take the cut. The minor twist came the following afternoon. A long-time client called to say she'd heard troubling things about our business. Whispers about missing funds, irregularities. She wouldn't say who told her, but I didn't need to ask. Daniel was softening the ground, preparing the story so when the blow came, the damage would stick. I began my countermeasure quietly. I reached out to 3 old associates, men who owed me favors from decades past. I told them nothing specific, only that I might need them soon, and that the matter concerned my son. The pause on the other end of the line told me they understood the gravity. That evening, I stayed late, working through the ledgers until my eyes burned. Daniel left before me, but not before stopping at the office door. "You've got a week," he said, smiling faintly. "After that, we let the chips fall." It was a gambler's phrase, but the way he said it made me think of more than cards. When I finally stepped outside, the black sedan was back, parked across the street with its lights off. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the shadowed windshield, before turning the key in my own car and driving away. I knew then that the final stretch was beginning. 1 week. That was all the time I had to dismantle what he'd built before it swallowed me whole. Those words were the first thing in my mind when I opened my eyes the next morning. 1 week, 7 days to unravel a trap that had taken months to set. And every hour I waited was another hour for Daniel to tighten the noose. I started by pulling every document I had from storage. Sales ledgers from 20 years back, client lists, purchase receipts. If I could prove the integrity of the business before his rot spread through it, maybe I could salvage more than my name. The air in the shop was thick with dust and tension. Daniel didn't show until late afternoon, and when he did, he looked like he hadn't slept. "Busy?" he asked, glancing at the piles of paper spread across my desk. I didn't answer. His gaze lingered for a moment. Then he smiled. Slow, deliberate. "Don't overwork yourself, old man. Wouldn't want you too tired when the week's up." The midpoint shift came that evening. A letter arrived, slipped under the front door while I was in the back. No envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with a typed message. "Your son's debts are now yours. Payment expected in 3 days." There was no signature, no instructions, just the words. It wasn't a demand, it was a verdict. I burned the letter in a metal waste bin, out back. No evidence, no trace. My father had taught me that the most dangerous threats were the ones you didn't let others see. But the truth was, the letter had done its work. It wasn't just Daniel who was on the clock now. It was me. The minor twist came the next morning when I found one of the display cases empty. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass. Just gone. A set of silver serving pieces, heirlooms from the 1920s, valued more for their history than their price. Daniel walked in minutes later, whistling. He didn't ask about the case. He didn't have to. That night, I called Mason, the man from the diner. I told him I was ready to talk. We met in the same booth, under the same flickering light. "You're out of time," he said, before I even sat down. "Daniel's been promising a payout he can't deliver, and now the promise is yours." I leaned forward. "What happens if I cut him off completely?" Mason didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted. "If you cut him off, he won't be the one we come for." That was all he said, enough to confirm what I'd suspected all along. My son had built his escape route out of my hide. Driving back from the meeting, the strip lights blurred in the windshield, and I thought about my father's pen, the forged signature, the empty display case. Daniel wasn't just dismantling the business. He was stripping me of every defense before the final blow. When I got home, I took out a small lockbox from the back of my closet. Inside were the things I'd never put in any ledger: private accounts, hidden reserves, assets. No one, not even Daniel, knew existed. If I was going to survive this, I'd have to use them. But once I opened that box, there would be no going back. And as I sat there, with the key in my hand, I realized the last major turn was coming. Not just for the business, but for everything I'd ever built. I didn't sleep that night. The lockbox stayed on the table in front of me, the metal cold under my fingertips. Opening it meant crossing a line I'd kept for decades, a line my father had drawn and warned me never to cross unless there was no other choice. By dawn, I'd made the decision. I opened the box. Inside were certificates, bonds, cash in neat stacks, and a ledger written in my own hand, a record of assets I'd kept hidden from the business, from the IRS, and most importantly, from Daniel. If he thought he'd stripped me bare, he hadn't even touched the bones. At the shop that morning, I moved like nothing had changed. Daniel came in late again, looking tired but restless. He didn't notice the envelope I'd slipped into my inside pocket, the one containing the first of several transfers I'd make to my hidden accounts overseas. The midpoint shift came when Daniel pulled me into the office, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious but lacking urgency, like he already knew he was winning. He laid another folder on the desk. Inside were photographs. Me, meeting Mason at the diner. Me, moving boxes into my car at night. Me, locking the safe after hours. "Insurance," Daniel said with a smirk, "in case you forget who's in control here." It was a threat, but more than that. It was proof that every move I'd made was under his eye. He wasn't just inside my business, he was inside my shadow. That evening, I made a call to one of the 3 old associates I'd warned earlier. His name was Callahan, a man who'd once cleared a rival's books in a single night, literally and figuratively. "It's time," I told him. He didn't ask questions. The minor twist came the next day, when I discovered Daniel hadn't shown up for work. No call, no message. Instead, a man I didn't know came in, tall, wearing a dark jacket, and asked for me by name. He slid a small card across the counter with just a single word printed on it. Soon. That word sat in my mind like a ticking clock. I didn't know if it meant the people Daniel owed were coming for him, or for me. Either way, time was running out faster than I'd planned. That night, I transferred the remainder of the hidden funds and placed certain documents in a sealed envelope for Callahan. If the worst happened, he'd know what to do. When I finally returned home, the lockbox was still sitting on the table, now empty. I didn't put it away. It felt like leaving it out was a reminder, a warning to myself that once you open certain doors, you don't get to close them again. And as I sat there in the quiet, I realized the end wouldn't be decided in the shop, or in the books, or in a lawyer's office. It would be decided face to face. That thought carried me into the morning like a weight in my chest. I didn't open the shop right away. Instead, I waited, sitting in the back office with the blinds drawn, my hands folded on the desk, listening to the hum of the old air unit. If this was going to end, I wanted it on my terms. Daniel arrived around noon. No folder this time, no smirk. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, leaning against it like he needed the frame to hold him up. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes red. But even in that state, I could see it. Something calculating still flickering under the exhaustion. "You've been busy," he said. No accusation, just a statement. I didn't answer. Silence has a way of forcing the truth to the surface. He dropped into the chair opposite mine and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They're coming for me, and for you if I don't deliver." The midpoint shift came when I realized he wasn't bluffing. The edge in his voice wasn't arrogance. It was fear. Real fear. "You think I don't know that?" I said quietly. "You dragged them into my house, Daniel. You gave them my name to chew on." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. For the first time in months, there was no posturing between us. No masks. Just two men at the end of a table they'd both helped build and both helped break. "You've got money stashed somewhere," he said finally. "Give me enough to get them off my back, and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." The minor twist was how much I wanted to believe him. Not for his sake, but for mine. To walk into my shop and never have to see his shadow against the glass again. It was a tempting picture. But my father's voice cut through the thought like a knife. A man who trades his blood for quiet will live to regret the silence. I leaned back, meeting his eyes. "You'll get nothing from me," I said. "If they come, they'll find you empty-handed, and maybe that's the only way you'll learn." His face hardened, but he didn't speak. We sat there in that heavy stillness until the sound of a car engine outside broke it. We both knew the sound didn't belong to a customer. It was smoother, heavier, the kind that didn't idle unless there was a reason. Daniel stood slowly, his chair scraping the floor. "Guess this is it," he muttered. I didn't follow him to the door. I stayed in my seat, staring at the ledger on the desk, the one that began in my grandfather's hand and ended in mine. Footsteps echoed on the sidewalk outside. Voices, low, deliberate. Then the door opened and the air changed. I never looked up to see who came in first. All I heard was Daniel's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "He's not part of this anymore. It's me you want." There was a pause. Then the door closed again. The shop was silent. Daniel was gone. So were the voices. And I was alone, sitting with the ledger. The hum of the air unit the only sound left. I don't know if he'll keep his word. I don't know if the shop will stay safe, or if the quiet is just the space before the next strike. But I do know this. Blood may bind, but it also burns. And once it burns, it leaves a mark you carry to your last day.